Hi friends, Reverend Cole here with the 28th episode of Questions for Cole. It is November 11th, 2020, Remembrance Day. I received a very interesting question from one of you this week. Let me read it to you. It says, "Hello Cole, I was just wondering how you decide how long your sermons or reflections should be. How do you know when you're finished? In other words, is there a point at which I say to myself, enough is enough?" Isn't that a good question? I had to put some thought into how to answer that because there really isn't an obvious answer. I do remember when I was back in theological college studying about sermons that there were a few techniques that we learned about, a few different styles of preaching, but there wasn't really an agreed upon time limit. I'm sure there are a lot of different opinions out there about how long a good sermon should be, both from ministers as well as from members of the congregations which they serve. I'm sure there's some opinions about when enough is enough. If the minister looks up and either sees people snoring in their seats or tapping their watches, that might be a sign either that the sermon is too long or that there just happened to be some very rude people in church that day. Sheesh. The good news these days is that everything is online, so if you think the sermon is too long, then I guess you can just skip over the ending and skip to the next hymn, or you can wander off and make yourself some tea or something while I finish up. Or if you think the sermon is too short, you could go back and listen to it a second time. Could happen. There's something to be said for this virtual church, don't you think? I suppose some of you might be skipping over the sermon altogether and just listening to the announcements and the hymns and maybe watching the creed and calling it a day. I'm not sure if that really counts as going to church. I'll leave that up to you and God. Anyway, back to the question, how do I know when I'm finished? Well, I just do. Next question. I'm actually not making that up. That is pretty much how it works. When I first started in ministry, I used to think in terms of pages. 4 pages was too short for a sermon. 8 pages was a bit long. 5 was pretty good, maybe still a bit on the short side. 6 pages was just about right. And I tried hard to make sure that every sermon was about that same length. If it was longer, I would try to cut something out. If it was too short, I would try to expand on one of the thoughts. If it was really too long, I might even make it into a 2-part sermon and spread it over 2 separate weeks. But that was way back when I was first starting out in ministry. Since then, it's developed into more of a feeling that I get when the sermon is done. Sometimes it may be on the short side, sometimes on the long side, but I just get a sense when what I've got prepared is the way it needs to be for that week. That doesn't mean that I won't change something at the last minute or even ad-lib something from the pulpit, depending on how the Spirit moves me. But for the most part, when I've got a finished sermon and I print it out on paper, that's pretty well what you're going to hear on Sunday morning. I don't really look at numbers of pages anymore. Well, I might look at them, but that doesn't dictate when a particular sermon is finished. They're still usually about 6 to 8 pages, although sometimes there are exceptions to that. It just depends. And I like to think, most importantly, that God is part of the process each week too. At least I sure try to ensure that I'm always being open to the message that God wants me to share with you every time I sit down to write. Thank you for that question. That was an interesting one to think about this week. If any of you have questions for these episodes, please send them in to cole@selkirkunitedchurch.ca, and I will try to get them all answered in the coming weeks. Until next time, have a good and safe week, and God be with you.